Wow, it sure is lovely to have Radagon as our Elden Lord. Well, I've had a very tiring shift, so I'm just gonna sit down and hopefully could get some rest.
Oh, I needed that. Hopefully I'm not late for my shift. Let's quickly pray to the tree and... What? What's happened to the tree? Where's Radagon? What? Who?
Welcome to a new video. Since this is my first ever Elden Ring video, I wanted to do a challenge that no one has ever attempted before. So with that being said, I'm going to beat Elden Ring without being seen or detected. But hang on, I know what you're thinking. The stealth in this game isn't the best. It's definitely not the main focus of the game or the mechanics that the developers want you to play the game with. As a result, you're pretty much limited to only crouching, mid to late game incantations and spells, and some very late game armor. That being said, Assassin's Gambit, an incantation that you can get quite early on in the game, is, well, you probably already know, but it's pretty overpowered. It's an extremely strong weapon art that's used by challenge runners quite a lot, usually to skip certain optional boss fights and areas simply by just walking past them. So I wanted to stretch this out and see if I can apply it to every aspect of the game until I beat it. Here are the rules for this challenge. I cannot be seen or detected by any enemy in the game. Since Elden Ring has no detection system, I will decide if I have been spotted if any enemy aggroes towards me. Initially, I was going to use the stamina bar to act as a detection meter, since it doesn't deplete if you're not in combat. But this wasn't really accurate, since there were a few instances in-game where you are forced into combat, despite if the enemy sees you or not. Bosses that are enclosed in arenas are an exception to this rule, since I have no choice but to fight them to progress the story. Mini-bosses are not an exception, and I will have to find a way to sneak around them. My run of this game should be doable by anybody running Elden Ring on any platform. And with those out of the way, let's get started with the challenge. At the beginning of the game, I didn't have much to use other than crouching to make me slightly quieter. I was forced into a fight with the beetle, but since this was in an enclosed arena, I was okay. Once I reached Limgrave, I snuck around the tree sentinel and entered the Church of LA to get the first sight of Grace. I snuck my way towards the next Grace point, stealth killing some guards along the way. Once I had Torrent, I made my way straight to the third Church of Marika to use the teleporter that gets you to Grail's Dragon Barrow. There weren't many enemies on this path, so it was pretty easy to get to the church, and I would need the flask for some incantations that I would need later on in the run anyway. I used the teleporter and took Melena's hand so she could take me to the Round Table Hold, where I used my first Swordstone key for something I would need later on in the run. I ran past the gargoyle and then cheesed the Knight's Cavalry for some runes. Next, I snuck around the dragon on the bridge by sticking to the outside edge and waiting for the dragon to walk past. After the dragon had passed me, I summoned Torrent, jumped over and quickly ran to the other edge, and ran around the Putrid Avatar to get the 4th Faroth Grace Point. Once I had enough runes and Swordstone keys, I went to the Round Table Hold to get the Assassin's Prayer Book and give it to the monk for specifically 2 incantations, the Darkness and Assassin's Approach incants. Are these incantations any good? No. They're probably the worst in the game, but I didn't really have a choice. I had to use these until I got the Assassin's Gambit. After buying the 2 incantations, I went to Lower Limgrave to buy some cookeries from this merchant. I cleared out this bridge leading to Lower Limgrave by standing on this rock and shooting the guards with a bow and arrow. For the 2 guards at the front, I just snuck up behind them and stabbed them in the back. For the rest of the guards on the bridge, I used arrows to lure them to the front, and once they were turned around, walking back, I ran up to them and stabbed them in the back. I also picked up the Faith Knot tier, since I didn't have the stats to use the incantations. Once I had the incantations and the cookeries, I could attempt the 2 forts to get the Dectus Medallion. Fort height was fairly easy. All I had to do was wait for the enemies at the front to die, sneak around the guards and the fort to get behind them, and then kill the enemies inside with my bow and arrow. When I got to the top of the stairs, I used the darkness incant to walk past this knight, who looks directly at the stairs that you come up from. Easy enough. Without being spotted. Here's how I did it. This bat on the ceiling would spot me just as I was about to go up the ladder, so I aggroed him first and lured him to the corner near the entrance. This would buy me some time to distract the others. I went in and threw kukris in precise locations to lure the bats as a group away from the ladder. Once they were all lured away, I snuck into the entrance, went up the ladder, and finally acquired the other half of the Deckness medallion. Here's the path that I took to get to Stormvale. I went around the guards at the gate front and up this spirit spring to the left. There was a field with giants in it, but I managed to sneak past them, and after scaling these rocks and collecting some runes from this gravesite, it was a pretty straight and simple path to the next grace point. I skipped Godric for now, using this side passage to get to Liurnia, so I could start and progress Raya's questline. After starting Raya's quest, I needed access to altars to progress it, so I went to the Grand Lift via the Carrier Manor route, purchasing some somber smithing stones from EG along the way. I snuck around on the outside using Assassin's Approach, and to be honest, getting to the Altus Plateau was a lot easier than I had expected. After getting the first Altus Grace Point, I met with Raya, who very kindly took me to Volcano Manor, where I could meet Bernal. Before completing the Manor contract, I needed a better weapon, so I went to get the Bloodhound's Fang and leveled it up to defeat the knight. I finally got my hands on the Assassin's Gambit, which would make this run 1,000 times easier. So easy, in fact, that after sneaking past the guards at the tunnel and killing Margit, I managed to sneak through Stormvale using Assassin's Gambit. I used kukris to distract the guards, and my bow and arrow to kill some of them, like the snipers. But I was shocked as to how well Assassin's Gambit was actually working. And Godric was, well, Godric. Not very difficult. At this point, I needed to kill one more demigod to have access to Leyndell, and since I had already been to Altus, the Redmane Castle teleporter was now active. There were no enemies inside the castle, and traversing Caelid wasn't too difficult either, since it's a very open area with only a few enemies here and there. So killing Radahn wasn't very difficult. I made my way to the DTS next, sneaking past these two tree sentinels. Using Assassin's Gambit, I stuck mainly to the edges of the rocks on the mountain to avoid being seen by the sniper golems. Once I got to the DTS, I realized I didn't get the Poison Mist incantation. So I went back, got Poison Mist, and poisoned the DTS. I now had access to Lane-Del. Lane-Del caused me many issues. I couldn't sneak past these white sacks of shit, since it looks like they're programmed to detect if the player gets too close. Instead of trying to sneak past them, I went and farmed some runes from Evergails, increasing my strength. My base strength plus the strength knot tier plus an upgraded Radahn's bow with Radahn's spears was enough to one-shot these enemies from a distance. I picked off most of these enemies one by one and made my way down to the elevator. You can just sneak past the perfumer in the room, and to skip the entire next area, I climbed onto this roof and jumped down to the area where the tree avatar spawns. I got close enough for it to spawn and hid in this archway until it walked past. The area after the Avenue Balcony Grace Point had a lot of cover, so I was able to just sneak past most of the enemies here. I distracted the ambush enemy behind this wall with a cookery and managed to kill him with a sneak strike. And the enemies on the massive tree branch I just pushed off with some gravity arrows. Piss Godfrey took me a couple of tries, but luckily there was a stake of Marika just outside the arena. After Piss Godfrey, the next grace point was the Queen's bedchamber. But just outside the bedchamber there is a Black Knife assassin, who will detect the player when they get too close. I tried a couple of methods to bypass her, including shooting at her from a distance, the Darkness incantation, Assassin's Gambit. Nothing worked. It seemed like the run was over, but I still had one more trick up my sleeve. I jumped onto the body of this finger reader crone and stood on the railing of the bridge. I made my way down to this small platform on the outside edge of the bridge, and from here I could throw cookeries to lure the assassin away while almost being completely out of view. Once she was far away enough and had her back towards me, I jumped up back onto the bridge and ran inside to get the next grace point. Before I fought Morgott, I went back to get the Bolt of Gransax, since I already had the Godfrey icon from farming Evergails, also cause I suck at this game. After Morgott was dealt with, I made my way back towards the sand area, where I snuck past the enemies pretty easily and killed the ones just before the bridge. I used Cookeries and Assassin's Gambit to distract the enemies on the horse, and after this I ran all the way to and through the first snow area, all the way up until the gargoyle spawns just before the rolled lift. The gargoyle was a massive issue here, since it spawned in based on player detection. Once you go past a certain part of the map, the gargoyle will spawn and aggro onto you almost immediately, even if it doesn't physically see you. I tried sneaking around the outside, killing it from a distance, jumping around the spawn area. Nothing really seemed to work. I had one last idea, but it would require bending the rules very slightly. If I was able to get the gargoyle to spawn but aggro onto something else, then that would be acceptable in my books. So I set off to get Latenna, one of the only summons that could take aggro straight away, since she was one of the best ranged summons in the game. Getting the secret medallion from Albus wasn't very difficult, since there's pretty much no one here. And the cave I had to get through to get Latenna was mostly filled with snails that I could one-shot with my bow. I fought the Bloodhound Knight in the arena and acquired Latenna. Before I spawned the gargoyle, I summoned Latenna so she could take aggro as soon as he spawned, and it worked like a charm. Before the gargoyle was even finished with his landing animation, Latenna took aggro from him, allowing me to slip past undetected. I quickly sat at the grace point to despawn the gargoyle, and then went up the lift. Surprisingly, the fire prelates didn't spot me, even though I snuck right past them with Assassin's Gambit. I avoided using Torrent just in case the golem gets alerted, so I kept using Assassin's Gambit and stuck to the walls to avoid being detected. Once I got to the next grace point, I realized that I couldn't get past Borealis since it was another enemy that spawns in by detecting the player's position. And this time I couldn't use Latenna since the arena was far too open and large. By the time Borealis attacks and kills Latenna, I wouldn't be able to get far away enough. So instead I went towards the heretical rise, where the invisible bridge is. After sneaking past some enemies at the foot of the bridge, I carefully scaled the invisible floor, and after getting to the balcony, I jumped out to the side, going around the building towards the front. As I went onwards, I realized that I was at the second fire prelate camp. Again, I kind of just walked right through, and no one really spotted me. From here to the fire giant, it was pretty desolate in terms of enemies. I upgraded my weapons and eventually killed the fire giant. Crumbling Farum Azula was much easier than I had expected. The first set of enemies that you encounter, I used Assassin's Gambit and snuck past them with ease, right under their noses. The dragon that spawns after the first grace point, I was able to use Latenna to buy me enough time to run to the other side and hide. From here to the next grace point, just before the Godskin duo, I just used Assassin's Gambit and snuck past most of the enemies. Before I fought the duo, I went into this cave in Limgrave and farmed some mushrooms to make sleep pots. Once I had enough, I fought the duo and killed them on my first try. Again, from here to the next grace point, I just used Assassin's Gambit and snuck past the enemies until I reached the checkpoint just after the optional Crucible Night. There was no way I could sneak past the dragon, and even if I did, I would have to deal with the birds that are along the path. So instead, I used the elevator just off to the side. And performed this skip that puts me just before the area where Banal spawns. And I carried on towards the bridge grace point. I also killed Rykard because why not? Screw Rykard. Also because I needed the Blasphemous Claw from Banal. The other two assassination contracts before Rykard were both in pretty empty areas, so getting to them wasn't too difficult. And as for Banal, well, he's already seen us multiple times already throughout the game, so being invaded by this particular NPC was still okay. After sneaking past the DTS, I actually had to properly learn the Malekith fight for the first time in my life. It was very difficult, but I did manage to beat him with the Bloodhound's Fang. And went to bully Gideon straight after. Before fighting Godfrey, I went to get the Mimic tier because I knew I couldn't beat Godfrey or Radagon without any help. There wasn't really a reliable method anymore to get runes to level up, so I tried going to the depths for the Mimic tier and surprisingly, it was very doable. All I had to do was sneak past these black jellies, sneak past these sleep enemies, sneak past the swordswoman to fight the Mimic tier, then distract some more black jellies with kukris and sneak past them, and now all that was left was to one-shot the swordswoman protecting the Mimic Tear ashes. I also grabbed some gloveworts and some upgrade materials for my weapons while I was here. I even managed to fight the gargoyle duo, take the coffin up the waterfall, ran to the next coffin, and grabbed some higher level gloveworts for my Mimic Tear. It was pretty simple in terms of the challenge from here, since there are only 2 boss fights left, and being detected isn't really a problem. All I had to do was finish the game, which I eventually did, and once the final cutscene played, I had completed the challenge. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. The more support these videos get, the more I can make with less time taken in between them. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other challenge run videos too. Thank you all very much for watching.
Our seed will look back upon us and recall an age of fracture.